The air over the Yorkshire Moors does not merely blow, it weeps. It is a land of ancient secrets and jagged edges, where the sky meets the heather in a bruise-coloured haze. But on this night, the heavens didn't just weep, they broke. Below, in a cottage of salt-stained stone, lived a woman who had already been broken by the world and rebuilt herself out of iron and silence. She was the ghost of the moors, a widow who expected nothing more from life than the cold comfort of her hearth. She had no idea that the river, in its fury, was about to bring her a duke, a conspiracy of blood, and a love that would burn hotter than any fire she had ever known. If this tale of secrets and second chances stirs your heart, please subscribe and like this video. I would love to hear in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what kind of historical romance would you like to hear next? Chapter 1. The Ghost of the Moors. The rain did not fall in Yorkshire that October. It attacked. It came down in great grey sheets that turned the sky into a leaden shroud, blurring the line between the peat-soaked earth and the heavy clouds. Inside her small stone cottage, Grace Hawthorne sat by a fire that seemed altogether too small for the vastness of the storm outside. Grace was only 27, but she carried the stillness of a woman who had lived 100 years. Her hands, calloused from the work of the garden and the loom, moved rhythmically as she mended a woolen stocking. She was a woman of never again. Never again would she let a man's laughter fill these rooms. Never again would she allow the soft, milky scent of a babe to break her heart. The fever had taken her husband, Thomas, and their infant daughter 4 years ago, leaving her with nothing but the haunting silence of the moors, and a soul she had carefully boarded up against the world. She was the ghost of the moors to the villagers 3 miles down the road. They spoke of her in hushed tones, the resilient widow who lived where the wind screamed loudest. They didn't know that her resilience wasn't a choice, it was a fortress. A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. Grace stood, her heart tripping a strange, forgotten beat. She moved to the window, wiping away the condensation with the side of her palm. Outside, the beck, the gentle stream that usually gurgled past her garden, had become a monstrous churning artery of mud and debris. Then she saw it. Through the veil of rain, the flickering yellow glow of carriage lanterns danced wildly. A coach and 4 was racing towards the old stone bridge, the driver clearly desperate to cross before the waters rose further. "No," Grace whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "The current is too high, the supports." As if the gods had heard her, the world let out a sickening tectonic groan. Even over the roar of the gale, she heard the crack of ancient stone giving way. The bridge didn't just break, it vanished into the maw of the river. The carriage, unable to stop its momentum on the slick mud, tilted. For a heartbeat, it hung suspended against the grey sky, a fragile box of wood and silk, before it plunged into the freezing maelstrom. Grace didn't think. She didn't pray. She didn't consider her own safety. The fortress she had built around her heart didn't crumble. It simply opened a door she thought had been rusted shut. She threw on her heavy oilskin cloak, grabbed a coil of thick hemp rope from the peg by the door, and sprinted into the teeth of the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The ground was a slurry of peat and water, but she knew these paths by touch. She reached the bank where the bridge had been, her eyes scouring the churning froth. About 30 yards downstream, the wreckage of the carriage was wedged against a massive fallen oak. The current was battering the wood, threatening to rip it away and send it tumbling toward the jagged falls further down. She tied the rope to a sturdy rowan tree, looping the other end around her waist with the practiced knots of a shepherd. Then she plunged into the grey water. The cold was absolute. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing her skin, reaching for her bones. She fought the current, her muscles screaming as she pulled herself along the rope toward the debris. When she reached the carriage, she saw a man. He was half submerged, his lower body pinned under a heavy structural timber of the coach. His face was a mask of agonizing paleness, blood blooming from a gash on his temple. But he wasn't trying to pull himself free. He was reaching upward, his arms trembling with a strength born of pure, primal desperation. In his hands, he held a large, waterproof leather basin, the kind used by wealthy travellers to carry linens, high above the swirling water. From inside the basin came a sound that pierced Grace's soul more sharply than the cold, the thin, wailing cry of infants.
"Help them!" the man gasped, his voice a ragged rasp, his eyes, a piercing dark grey even in the gloom, locked onto hers. He didn't ask her to save him. He didn't tell her who he was. In that moment, he was not a duke. He was simply a father at the end of his strength. "Please, my sons." Grace reached out, her fingers numb and blue, and grasped the edge of the leather basin. She saw them, two tiny faces, red-cheeked and screaming, wrapped in layers of fine wool. Thomas and William. "I have them!" she screamed over the wind. "I have them!" With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hoisted the basin onto the flat top of the fallen oak, securing it in the crook of a branch. Then she turned back to the man. "The timber is too heavy," she cried, grabbing his arm. "Leave me," he groaned, his eyes fluttering. His chest was clearly crushed, his breath coming in shallow, wet rattles. "Save the boys. Get them to the cottage." "I am not leaving anyone to this river," Grace spat, her Yorkshire grit surfacing. "Not today, not ever again." Using a piece of broken carriage wood as a lever, she braced herself against the oak and heaved. She screamed with the effort, her vision blurring. Slowly, the timber shifted. She grabbed the man under his arms, his weight nearly dragging them both under, and hauled him toward the bank. It was a slow, torturous crawl. Every inch was a battle against the river's hunger. By the time she dragged the man and the basin onto the muddy bank, Grace's lungs felt as though they were filled with glass.
The man, Henry, the Duke of Somerville, had fallen into a deep, deathly unconsciousness. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and his coat was soaked with blood. Grace looked at the two infants, who were now shivering, their cries weakening as the damp chill set in. She looked at her cottage, a tiny spark of light on the hillside, and then at the broken man at her feet. She had spent years trying to stay dead to the world. Now the world had arrived at her doorstep, bleeding and screaming for life. She picked up the basin in one arm and threw the Duke's arm over her shoulder, beginning the impossible ascent up the muddy slope. She was a woman of stone and earth, and tonight she would have to be enough. Chapter 2. The Hearth and the Shadow. The world beyond the thick stone walls of the cottage had ceased to exist. For 3 days the rain had not relented, turning the moors into a vast inland sea, and the cottage into a lonely island of survival. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, damp wool, and the metallic tang of blood. Grace Hawthorne had not slept. Her body moved on a tether of pure, stubborn instinct. She had set the Duke's leg, an agonizing ordeal that had forced a single guttural scream from his unconscious lips, and bound his crushed ribs with strips of her finest linen. But her greatest battle was not with his broken bones, it was with the cold. The infants, Thomas and William, were so small, their lives flickering like candle flames in a draught. In the deepest hours of the second night, when their cries had turned to terrifyingly weak whimpers and their skin felt like marble, Grace had known that blankets would not be enough.
She had stripped to her shift, sat before the dying embers of the hearth, and tucked the two babes against her bare skin, wrapping her heavy woolen cloak around the three of them. She had hummed a low, vibrating melody, a song her mother had sung in the shadow of the Pennines, feeling their tiny heartbeats begin to sync with her own. She was a woman who had sworn never again to the love of a child, yet here she was, offering her own life's heat to keep the Duke's lineage from freezing. Henry woke on the fourth morning to the sound of that humming. His first sensation was pain, a blinding white-hot roar in his chest and leg. His second was the smell, lavender and oatcakes, a scent so far removed from the stale beeswax and perfume of London that for a moment he believed he had died and been reborn in a simpler world. He opened his eyes, his vision blurring. He was lying on a narrow, remarkably clean rope bed near the fire, and there by the window where the grey morning light fought through the storm, sat his saviour. Grace was bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the moors. She was singing to William, cradling him with a natural, weary grace that made Henry's throat ache. Her hair, a dark, tumbled mahogany, had escaped its pins, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She didn't look like the hovering, sycophantic servants of Somerville Hall, nor the glittering porcelain debutantes who fainted at the sight of a bruised knee. She looked like the earth itself, ancient, unyielding, and beautiful. "You're awake," she said, her voice a low contralto that seemed to vibrate in the small room. She didn't move towards him immediately. She finished the verse of her song, ensuring the babe was settled, before rising.
"The boys," Henry rasped, the word tearing at his throat. "Alive, ravenous, and currently sleeping," Grace replied, approaching the bed. She placed a cool hand on his forehead, checking for the fever that had been threatening to take him. Her touch was clinical, yet Henry felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with his injuries. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Grace Hawthorne, and you are in my home, or what's left of it after the river tried to claim us all." "I am Somerville," he managed, trying to sit up. A gasp of agony escaped him as his ribs protested. "You are a man with 3 broken ribs and a leg that will take weeks to knit," she said firmly, her hand pressing gently but unyieldingly against his shoulder to keep him down. "I don't care if you are the King of England. In this cottage, you are a patient. You will stay still, or you will bleed out on my only good rug." Henry looked up at her, stunned. He had spent his entire life being deferred to, managed and plotted against. To be spoken to with such blunt, honest care was a revelation. He watched her as she moved about the room, preparing a broth of bone and wild leek. Every movement was purposeful. She was a woman who knew the value of a single candle, the weight of a winter, and the fragility of life. Over the next 2 weeks, the forced proximity of the cottage wove a web between them. There was no room for the pretenses of the aristocracy in 12 square feet of space. Henry watched her nurse his sons, saw the shadow of a profound grief in her eyes when she looked at them, and realized she was a widow who had lost her own. He found himself yearning for her presence when she stepped outside to check the stores. He, who had always found silence oppressive, found it sacred when shared with her. He began to see that his title was a gilded cage, and this woman, this crag-side angel who scrubbed floors and saved lives with equal ferocity, was the only truly free person he had ever met. One evening, while the rain finally turned to a soft mist, Henry watched her mending his torn coat. "Why did you do it?" he asked softly. "You risked everything. The river should have taken you." Grace didn't look up, but her needle paused. "I told myself never again, Henry, but the river doesn't care about our vows. It only cares about what it can break. I decided I wouldn't let it break one more thing." The air in the room shifted, thick with an unspoken tension, a yearning that transcended class and circumstance, but the peace was shattered the next morning. While Grace was cleaning the heavy, blood-stained wool of Henry's travelling coat, a small, sodden piece of parchment fell from a hidden inner pocket. She picked it up, intending to dry it by the fire. But as the ink became legible in the heat, her blood ran cold. It wasn't a business letter. It was a correspondence Henry had clearly intercepted before his journey. "The supports are weakened. The bridge will not hold a carriage of that weight. Ensure the line ends in the water. J." Grace stared at the letter, then at the Duke sleeping fitfully on her bed, and finally at the 2 innocent babes in the cradle. The storm outside had passed, but a much more dangerous tempest was closing in.
The bridge hadn't fallen, it had been murdered, and the murderer was still out there, likely searching for the bodies that had never washed up.
Chapter 3. The Gilded Cage and the Stone Heart. The letter felt like a shard of ice in Grace's palm. She looked at Henry, who was watching her with a newfound clarity in his grey eyes. When she showed him the sodden parchment, his face didn't register surprise, only a hollow, weary sort of grief. "My cousin, Julian," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He was always a man of shadows, but I did not think he would murder children for a title." The peace of the cottage was shattered an hour later by the thunder of hooves, not the chaotic rhythm of the storm, but the disciplined gallop of the Duke's own household guard. They had found the wreckage and followed the trail of broken reeds to the only sanctuary on the moor. The transition was jarring. Suddenly, the small room was crowded with men in fine livery, their voices booming against the rafters. Henry was no longer the broken man Grace had warmed with her own body. He was His Grace, the Duke of Somerville. The authority returned to his shoulders like a heavy, invisible cloak. "Grace," Henry said, reaching for her hand as his men prepared a litter to carry him. "Come with us. You saved the heirs to an empire. You saved me. There is a place for you in London, a life of comfort, of safety. You will never want for anything again." Grace looked at the fine silk of the guards' uniforms, then at her own stained apron and the humble stone walls that had been her fortress. She thought of the ton, of the whispering ballrooms and the sharp, judgmental eyes of a society that would see her as a curiosity, a peasant savior, to be petted and then forgotten.
"I am a woman of the earth and stone, Henry," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I do not belong in a gilded cage, even one lined with velvet. I will not be your charity case, a reminder of a night you would rather forget. Go, secure your sons, take your justice, but leave me to my moors." The separation was a physical ache. As the carriage disappeared into the mist, taking the warmth of the boys and the intensity of Henry's gaze with it, the silence that rushed back into the cottage felt like a tomb. For months, London was a blur of mahogany and malice for Henry. He moved through the halls of power like a ghost. He stripped Julian of his holdings, watched the man be exiled in disgrace, and secured the safety of Thomas and William. He sat at grand dinners where the wine was expensive and the conversation was hollow. He was surrounded by the most beautiful women in England, yet he found himself searching for a scent of lavender and the sound of a Yorkshire accent that didn't know how to lie. Duty had always been his god, but he realized now it was a hollow one. Every time he looked at his sons, he saw the woman who had breathed life into them when the world had turned cold. He realized that a duke's crown was a heavy thing, but it was weightless compared to the peace he had felt in a one-room cottage during a deluge. He did not send a carriage. He did not send a messenger. 6 months after the flood, Grace stood in her garden, her eyes instinctively scanning the road as she did every twilight. She was thinner, the loneliness having carved hollows beneath her cheekbones. The sound of a single horse echoed across the beck.
Henry rode alone, his boots caked in mud, his fine coat discarded for a simple rider's cloak. He didn't wait for her to speak. He dismounted, his legs still bearing a slight, permanent limp, and walked toward her until only a breath of Yorkshire air separated them. "I tried to live without the ghost," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the palace felt like a cellar, and the city felt like a desert. I am not here to bring you to London, Grace. I have moved my household. Somerville Hall is now my only home. I don't want a duchess who knows how to curtsy to a king. I want the woman who fought a river for my soul." He didn't offer her jewels or a title. He offered her a life of purpose. When they married, the aristocracy whispered. They called her the peasant duchess and waited for her to fail. But Grace Hawthorne did not change for the title. She changed the title to fit her. She opened the gates of Somerville Hall, turning the cold, echoing rooms into an orphanage for the children the world had forgotten. At the local festival, standing before the very people who had once called her a ghost, Henry held her hand and presented his thriving sons. "I owe my life to this woman," he told the crowd, his voice ringing with a pride that silenced every critic. "But more than that, I owe her the man I have become." The silence of Somerville Hall was gone forever, replaced by the laughter of the sons she had saved and the steady, enduring heart of a husband who had finally found a reason to stay. The fire in the hearth may dim, and the storms may return to the moors, but some loves are forged in the flood and tempered by the flame. Grace and Henry found that the greatest legacy isn't written in bloodlines or titles, but in the lives we save and the hearts we choose to keep. Their story remains a whisper in the Yorkshire wind, a reminder that even the coldest stone can be warmed by a love that refuses to let go.